Welcome to The Last Hike. Today I'll go over what the Death Valley climb did to 4 gym rats. Convinced their endurance could outmuscle a deadly trail, these swole-mates climbed deep into that trail and purposely avoided rangers. Now what the summer heat did to them will make you rethink every time you've ever confused physical strength with actual survival instinct. This story starts in July 16, 2019, with 4 gym buddies named Mason Price, Derek Alvarez, Silas Crane, and Tobias Renner. Mason was 29, Derek was 31, Silas was 28, Tobias was 30. They'd been training together for years at the same gym, and from what people who knew them said, they were the kind of friends who couldn't just lift weights together without turning it into some kind of contest. Who could bench more? Who could run faster? Who could go longer without eating before a workout? You could pick literally anything, and these 4 had probably already argued about it. At some point, the conversation turned to endurance, and somebody brought up Death Valley. You've probably heard of it, even if you've never been close to it. It's one of the hottest places on the planet during the summer, with temperatures that regularly climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Mason, Derek, Silas, and Tobias heard about how brutal the heat could get out there, and instead of filing that away as a fun fact, they turned it into a bet. Whoever gave up first on a hike through the park would owe the other 3 an entire year of gym membership fees. I want to pause right here because this is the part that gets me every time I think about it. A year of membership fees is, what, maybe $600? $800 if the gym is fancy? These 4 were about to risk their lives over something you could solve by just paying for your own membership and not betting it. That's the thing about competitive friendship sometimes. The stakes don't even have to make sense. It's never really about the money. It's about not being the one who backs down. Here's where it also gets really interesting for me, and honestly also a little bit disturbing. These 4 didn't just wake up one day and drive out to the desert. They spent almost 3 weeks planning this thing. Most of that planning focused on the challenge itself. They wanted an empty trail, uninterrupted footage, and a chance to prove they could handle conditions that most people avoided. Part of that meant not advertising the plan to people who might try to talk them out of it. Think about that for a second. They weren't breaking rules or entering restricted areas. The 4 hikers believed they were skilled and prepared enough to handle conditions that others couldn't. Despite repeatedly encountering warnings against strenuous hiking in extreme heat, they viewed those warnings as being meant for less capable people, not themselves. They thoroughly researched the trail, weather, maps, and trip reports, but ultimately underestimated the danger of the heat. I think this is where their thinking went completely sideways, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Most people read a warning like that and think, okay, I shouldn't go. These 4 read the same warning and thought, great, that means the trail will be empty. They took a list of reasons to stay away and flipped it into a list of reasons the plan would work. It's such a small shift in thinking, but it changes everything that happens after. During planning, the 4 men saw the extreme heat as an advantage rather than a danger. With fewer visitors during heat waves, they expected an empty trail where they could carry out their challenge without interference. To avoid encountering others, they chose a remote trail, picked a Tuesday instead of a busy weekend, and planned to start before sunrise. Their decisions were aimed at minimizing contact with anyone who might discourage them from continuing. Now, before I go further into the story, I want to know your first reaction to hearing that they were actively trying to avoid people who might talk them out of it. Let me know in the comments. Honestly, this part bugs me more than almost anything else in this story. They did real research, they weren't lazy about it, they just used all that information backward. It's like reading a manual on how a bomb works and concluding the best plan is to stand closer to it. As they researched more, their confidence grew instead of their caution. Studying maps, forecasts, and trail information gave them a false sense of expertise, leading them to believe that their fitness and gym experience would protect them from the desert's dangers. They increasingly viewed heat warnings as advice for unprepared tourists rather than for people like themselves. They also concealed key details from family and friends, describing the trip as ordinary sightseeing rather than a competitive challenge. They avoided discussing the wager, the specific trail, or their plans online, hoping to prevent experienced hikers from discouraging them. Their intention was to document the challenge and reveal it afterward as proof of the outcome. By the final week before the hike, isolation wasn't just a side effect of their planning anymore. It had become the goal. They pictured an empty trail where nobody could interrupt their competition. Nobody could see either of them quit, and nobody could tell them they'd gone too far. And here's the tragic irony of the whole thing. Every single safeguard they removed from their own plan was also a potential source of help that they were throwing away without realizing it. And the worst part is that their plan worked. It worked almost perfectly. The morning they set out, they barely saw anyone. No ranger happened to be in the area that morning, which wasn't unusual given the sheer size of Death Valley and how few people were hiking remote trails during extreme heat. No experienced hiker on the trail questioned their route or their timing. No friend called partway through the day to check in. All that privacy they worked so hard to build for themselves ended up meaning that when things started going wrong, there was nobody nearby who could recognize it and step in. Before they even started hiking, the four of them sat down and came up with a set of rules for their competition. And reading through what investigators later pieced together from their footage, these rules are almost unbelievable in how reckless they were. Not one of them was allowed to voluntarily quit without losing the bet outright. Any rest stop longer than 5 minutes counted as a sign of weakness. Any complaint about the heat or about being tired was treated as nothing more than an excuse. Every major checkpoint along the route had to be filmed as proof they'd actually reached it. And whoever made it to the turnaround point first would get extra bragging rights on top of winning the bet. So basically, in the span of a few sentences, a goofy competition between friends turned into a set of rules that actively punished either one of them for admitting they were struggling.
That's the part that really gets under my skin. They built a system where the smart decision, stopping, resting, turning around, was treated as failure.
They engineered their own peer pressure into the trip before they'd even taken a single step. They started hiking before the sun came up, just like they'd planned. For the first several miles, everything felt easy. The temperature was still relatively bearable in those early hours, and all four of them were full of energy. Their phones captured non-stop trash talk between them. Mason bragged that years of heavy lifting and serious conditioning had basically prepared him for anything the desert could throw at him. Derek pushed back, insisting that mental toughness mattered way more than any hydration plan or safety precaution. Silas claimed his trail experience put him a step ahead of everyone else. Tobias just laughed and said he'd settle the whole argument by finishing first.
Watching this part of the footage, if you didn't know how the story ended, you'd think you were watching four confident athletes treating a desert hike just like another gym challenge.
They laughed at the warning signs posted along the trail about extreme heat. They joked that people online had clearly exaggerated how bad it could get. The trail being nearly empty only made them more confident, because to them, every mile they covered without seeing another soul felt like proof their planning had paid off. At several points in the footage, they comment on how few people they've seen out there. Mason jokes that the whole park basically belongs to them now. Derek responds that this is exactly why they picked a weak forecast to experience some of the most extreme temperatures of the summer to do this.
I think this moment is honestly the saddest part of the early footage, even though nothing bad has really happened yet.
Not one of them understood that the emptiness around them wasn't a reward for being tough. It was a warning that almost everyone else had already decided the conditions were unsafe, and they were the only four who hadn't gotten the message yet. Once the sun actually rose, everything started changing fast. The landscape around them began throwing heat back at them from every direction. There were long stretches of trail with almost no shade anywhere in sight. Sweat poured off all four of them, and within a relatively short stretch of time, their shirts were completely soaked through. Derek noticed he was drinking a lot more water than he'd planned for. Mason developed a headache, but brushed it off as just normal exertion from the hike. Silas started favoring one leg slightly, but didn't say anything. Tobias felt his pace slipping, but kept pushing to stay even with the others. Their conversations got shorter. The joking that had filled the early morning faded out. None of them said out loud that the effort was becoming harder than they'd expected. Instead, each guy looked at the others struggling and saw it as proof that the competition was actually working the way it was supposed to. The trail stayed mostly empty through this stretch. Hours passed without any real contact with another person. What had felt like freedom earlier in the morning now meant there was nobody around to notice just how quickly things were changing for the four of them. Heat radiated straight up from the sun-baked rock and dirt under their boots, and the ground itself seemed to be holding onto that warmth and throwing it right back at them. Like the whole desert was cooking them from every angle at once.
This is the point in the story where if you'd be a somewhat reasonable person, you would have turned around.
The headache, the sweat, the sudden water consumption, those are your body's early warning lights. But because they'd built this whole competition around punishing weakness, none one of them could let themselves see those warning signs for what they actually were. As the temperature kept climbing, the whole thing got more aggressive. The four of them started racing certain stretches of the trail. Whenever one guy stopped for even a brief moment, the others pushed ahead without him. Small breaks that should have been opportunities to rest turned into chances to gain an advantage in the competition. When Derek suggested taking a longer break at one point, Mason immediately mocked him for it on camera. When Mason started breathing heavily, climbing a steep section, Derek accused him of slowing down on purpose. When Silas asked if anyone else was feeling dizzy, Tobias brushed it off as nothing. None of them wanted to look weaker than the others, and their decisions, every single one of them at this point, were being driven by pride instead of by what their bodies were actually telling them. The environment that had felt totally manageable before sunrise now felt openly hostile. The air kept getting hotter with every hour that passed. Heat radiated up from the ground while the sun beat straight down on them from above, basically squeezing them between two sources of heat. And still, no one was willing to admit out loud that maybe they had underestimated exactly what the desert could do to them.
I keep coming back to this idea of pride overriding instinct, because I think it's the actual core of this whole tragedy. These weren't dumb guys.
They were fit, they were prepared on paper, they did their research. But pride is sneaky. It convinces you that admitting weakness is more dangerous than the actual physical danger you're standing in. And by this point in the hike, that's exactly the trap they'd fallen into. By mid-morning, all four of them realized they'd gone through way more water than they had planned for. Before the hike even started, each of them had packed roughly 2 gallons. During their research, they'd seen recommendations suggesting that extreme summer conditions could require far more water than that, especially on exposed routes, but everyone convinced themselves that their fitness and early start would make those estimates overly cautious. At the time, 2 gallons had seemed like more than enough. But a few hours into the heat, all 4 of them were shocked at how fast their supplies were disappearing. And instead of treating this discovery as a reason to slow down or turn back, it sparked a whole new competition between them. Rather than having an honest conversation about how to manage the situation safely, everyone became fixated on proving they were handling the heat better than the others. Derek started quietly rationing his water without saying anything. Mason started sneaking bigger gulps whenever nobody was watching. Silas began hiding how much he had left, while Tobias started timing his sips so the others wouldn't notice how thirsty he really was. They kept checking each other's bottles throughout the day. Nobody wanted to admit any concern, because in their minds, showing concern was basically the same thing as surrendering.
Gotta be honest, I shook my head on this one.
Because running out of water faster than expected in Death Valley in the summer should be an obvious, flashing red alarm. It's not a small detail. It's basically the most important warning your body and your supplies can give you out there, and these 4 looked at that warning and decided it was just another obstacle to push through rather than a reason to stop. As the temperature pushed toward genuinely dangerous levels, the first serious symptoms started showing up. Mason developed worsening headaches, along with occasional dizziness. Derek started getting painful muscle cramps in his legs. Silas began losing his balance on flat ground. Tobias started slurring his words without noticing. All of them became increasingly irritable, started making small mistakes they normally wouldn't have made, and found themselves arguing over minor issues that hadn't seemed important earlier in the morning. Their pace noticeably slowed down. The video clips they were still recording got shorter, because by this point, just talking required real effort. Long silences started appearing between the recordings. In one clip, Mason struggled to remember a distance estimate he himself had mentioned earlier that same day. In another, Derek just pauses for several seconds, clearly trying to recall what the next checkpoint on their route was supposed to be. In one of Silas's last clear recordings, he repeats the same sentence twice without realizing it. Tobias, in his, just stares at the camera for several seconds before saying anything at all. All of them laughed these moments off when they happened. What made the situation especially dangerous was that the warning signs weren't arriving one at a time. Forgetfulness, irritability, poor decisions, physical exhaustion, and misplaced confidence were all beginning to overlap and reinforce one another. No one recognized them as warning signs, even though to anyone watching from the outside, and especially to anyone who knows anything about heat illness, those moments are about as clear a red flag as you can get. The heat at this point was becoming genuinely overwhelming. Temperatures kept rising while the 4 of them stayed out in the open, with basically no real protection from the sun. Mason kept pulling out the trail map and studying it, but he was struggling to interpret information that he'd reviewed in detail before the hike even started. Derek kept forgetting where he'd packed certain pieces of equipment in his own backpack. Silas kept asking the others how far they'd already gone, even though he'd asked minutes before. Tobias kept stopping to check a checkpoint marker that wasn't actually there yet. Simple conversations between them started turning into arguments. They debated distances they had already covered together. They disagreed about how much water was actually left between them. They kept asking each other questions that had already been answered just minutes earlier. Mason noticed that Derek was becoming unusually forgetful and irritable, but he chalked it up to exhaustion, making his friend dramatic. Derek noticed Mason struggling with basic navigation decisions, but he dismissed it as Mason just being stubborn. Silas noticed Tobias slurring his words, but figured he was just tired. Tobias noticed Silas stumbling, but assumed he'd twisted his ankle. None of them stopped to consider that they were all actively showing signs of heat-related cognitive impairment.
I want to slow down here for a second because I want to stress out that heat exhaustion and heat stroke don't just hurt your body.
They hurt your brain. They mess with your ability to recognize that something is wrong in the first place. So you end up with this horrible situation where the exact thing that's putting you in danger is also the thing stealing away your ability to notice the danger. These four weren't just getting physically weaker. Their judgment, the one tool that could have saved them, was breaking down right along with everything else. By late morning, all four men were showing obvious signs of severe heat stress, and yet none of them believed they were actually in serious danger. Mason kept insisting on camera that he felt fine, even while he was visibly stumbling on flat ground. Derek laughed off his own symptoms, claiming he'd pushed through worse during regular gym workouts. Silas insisted his balance issues were just an old knee injury acting up. Tobias claimed he was talking slow on purpose, like it was some kind of joke. Their videos from this stretch capture increasingly irrational conversations. They talked about completing extra mileage after finishing the challenge, like they were planning some kind of victory lap. They made wildly unrealistic estimates about how quickly they could finish the rest of the route. To anyone watching this footage afterward, it's obvious almost instantly that none of them was thinking clearly anymore. But to the four of them, in that moment, everything still felt completely manageable. As the temperature kept climbing, all of their phones started showing overheating warnings after extended periods of recording in direct sunlight. Recording became more and more sporadic as the devices repeatedly shut down the camera function until they could cool back down. Even their equipment was struggling to survive out there, and somehow that still didn't register as a sign for any of them to stop. Eventually, the tension between them boiled over completely. Mason started blaming Derek for encouraging the challenge in the first place. Derek blamed Mason for picking an overly ambitious route. Silas blamed Tobias for talking everyone into a remote trail instead of a marked one. Tobias blamed Silas for insisting they push through midday instead of resting in the shade. They accused each other of wasting water. They accused each other of slowing down the pace and dragging the whole thing out. The argument kept escalating and getting more confused as it went. None of them could really articulate what they were even upset about anymore. Small, minor grievances turned into full-blown confrontations. Eventually, the argument shifted toward their remaining water and what direction they should take next. Derek wanted to slow down and reconsider the route. Mason accused him of using that as an excuse to quit. Derek fired back that Mason had pushed them too far into the heat. Silas sided with Mason, Tobias sided with Derek. After several increasingly confused arguments about water, pace, and navigation, the group split into two pairs, each one going their own direction. Each of them had convinced himself that the others were the entire reason the day had gone so badly.
I want you to imagine that scenario. Four guys who started the day as best friends and training partners ended up splitting apart from each other.
Alone, in one of the hottest places on Earth, because their judgment had deteriorated to the point where teaming up felt worse than going it alone.
If there's a single decision in this entire story that sealed their fate, I think it's this one.
Once they separated, all four of their conditions got worse fast. Mason kept recording occasional updates on his phone, and honestly, the footage from this stretch is hard to watch. He repeats the same observations multiple times without seeming to realize he's already said them. He struggles to hold the phone steady, his speech becomes increasingly disorganized and hard to follow. At one point in the recordings, he even seems uncertain about which direction he's actually traveling in. Investigators later determined that he gradually wandered away from the route they had originally planned, likely without even realizing it. Silas, who'd paired off with Mason, his final recordings show him sitting motionless for long stretches, occasionally mumbling about needing to catch up to the others. Derek's decline looked a little different. He started sitting down repeatedly for what he believed were just brief rests, but each stop ended up lasting longer than the one before it. He began leaving pieces of equipment behind along the trail because carrying them simply felt too exhausting. Investigators later used those abandoned items to piece together a rough timeline of his decline as the day went on. His final recordings are full of long pauses and incomplete thoughts that just trail off. Several recordings he apparently tried to make were never even completed because his phone kept overheating after sitting exposed to direct sunlight on the open trail. Tobias, paired with Derek, drifted away from him gradually, the two losing sight of each other without either one noticing exactly when it happened.
Can't even begin to imagine how alone they all were by this point, even though they'd started the morning literally side by side.
The whole point of their plan had been privacy, no interference, no witnesses, and now here they were, each one fading away separately, with nobody around to notice and absolutely nobody to help. By early afternoon, all four men were suffering from severe heat illness, with many of the symptoms later believed by investigators to be consistent with heat stroke, and none of them was capable of making sound decisions anymore. Basic movement had become incredibly difficult. Distances that should have taken just minutes to cover stretched out far longer than that. Their remaining water disappeared completely. The videos from this point on are fragmented and confusing, with large gaps appearing between recordings. None of them fully acknowledged just how severe the situation had become. All of them kept holding on to the belief that they could recover after resting just a little bit longer. None of them did. When Mason, Derek, Silas, and Tobias didn't come home that night, their families eventually reported them missing. Search teams started retracing likely routes through the park, but the investigation initially had to consider several possible paths. Since none of the families had any idea about the wager or the specific challenge the four men had actually planned, all they'd been told was that it was a simple sightseeing trip. Searchers eventually located all four men, scattered miles apart from each other, exactly where their decision to split up had left them. They were dead for multiple hours already. Their phones held dozens of short video clips, interrupted recordings, GPS data, and timestamps documenting that slow slide from confidence at sunrise to confusion by the afternoon. Using GPS data, the abandoned gear scattered along the trail, timestamps from the videos, and the footage itself, investigators were able to reconstruct large portions of the day's events, although significant gaps remained where no recordings existed and none of the men were present to explain exactly what happened. What that footage ultimately revealed is that none of them died because of one single mistake. They spent hours making increasingly poor decisions while their judgment slowly broke down in the extreme heat. One small bad call after another, until there was nothing left to fall back on. A challenge that started as a test of who had more endurance ended up becoming something much darker, a demonstration of just how fast even four genuinely fit, capable guys can lose the ability to recognize danger once heat illness really takes hold.
And that, to me, is the whole reason this story has stuck. It wasn't recklessness in one big dramatic moment. It was recklessness built quietly, decision by decision, until there was no way out left.